Welcome, friend, to this gentle journey through the gilded halls of Versailles and into the tumultuous world of 18th century France. Tonight, we drift together into the extraordinary life of a young Austrian princess who would become one of history's most fascinating and tragic figures. Whether you're settling in for sleep or simply seeking respite from the modern world, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet hours with me. I'd love to hear where you're listening from tonight. What corner of the world has brought you to this story of royal splendor and revolutionary upheaval? If this kind of soothing historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing for more tales that can carry you gently into rest. We have countless stories waiting to unfold in these tranquil evening hours. What I'm about to share with you isn't just another tale of royal excess and political intrigue. This is the remarkable story of Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna, who would become Marie Antoinette, Queen of France. A woman whose name alone could ignite passion, fury, and fascination across an entire nation. Have you ever wondered how a 14-year-old girl from Austria could become the most hated woman in France? The answer lies not in the simple narrative of a spoiled queen, but in a complex web of political machinations, cultural misunderstandings, and the violent birth pangs of modern democracy. Tonight, I'll take you inside the private chambers and public spectacles of Versailles, where a young woman struggled to navigate impossible expectations, while an entire kingdom teetered on the edge of revolution. By the end of our journey together, you'll understand how Marie Antoinette became both a symbol of royal excess and a tragic victim of forces far beyond her control. But before we enter the opulent world of French royalty, let me paint you a picture of the Europe that shaped her destiny. The year was 1755, when Maria Antonia was born into the Habsburg dynasty, rulers of the vast Austrian Empire. This was a world where marriages were treaties, where children were diplomatic tools, and where the fate of nations could rest on the shoulders of a teenage girl. The Holy Roman Empire stretched across Central Europe like a magnificent tapestry, with Vienna as its glittering capital. Here, in the Hofburg Palace, Empress Maria Theresa ruled with an iron will disguised by maternal warmth. She had survived wars, political conspiracies, and the constant challenge of governing diverse peoples speaking dozens of languages. Maria Theresa understood power in ways that would shape her daughter's destiny. She knew that survival in the treacherous world of European politics required not just intelligence and courage, but the ability to transform personal relationships into political alliances. When she looked at her beautiful daughter, Maria Antonia, she saw not just a child, but a future queen who could cement Austria's relationship with its ancient enemy, France. The little Archduchess grew up surrounded by luxury that would make modern billionaires envious. The Schönbrunn Palace, her summer residence, contained over 1,400 rooms decorated with the finest art Europe could produce. Chinese porcelain competed with Flemish tapestries for wall space, while crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns across marble floors that had been polished to mirror perfection. Yet beneath this splendor lay the rigid structure of imperial protocol that governed every moment of Maria Antonia's young life. From the moment she could walk, the future Marie Antoinette was taught that her personal desires were secondary to the needs of the state. Her education focused not on literature or philosophy, but on the arts of pleasing others. She learned to dance with ethereal grace, to speak French with perfect pronunciation, and to maintain composure under the scrutinizing gaze of courtiers who watched her every gesture for signs of weakness or strength. The young Archduchess possessed a natural charm that would serve her well and doom her completely. Her laugh was described as musical, her manner as effortlessly engaging. She could make even the most pompous diplomat feel like the most interesting person in the room, a talent that her mother recognized as both a gift and a potential liability. Maria Theresa worried that her daughter's open nature might make her vulnerable to manipulation by those who would use her kindness against Austria's interests. These concerns proved prophetic when French ambassadors arrived in Vienna to negotiate the marriage treaty that would transform Maria Antonia into Marie Antoinette. The French court had specific requirements for their future queen that went far beyond diplomatic necessity. She would need to abandon not just her Austrian identity, but her Austrian loyalties, becoming completely French in thought, word, and deed. The negotiations revealed the complex dynamics that would plague Marie Antoinette's entire reign. France needed this marriage to neutralize Austrian threat to French ambitions in Europe. But the French people harbored deep suspicions about any queen who came from their traditional enemy. The marriage would create a Dauphine who was simultaneously essential to French policy and fundamentally mistrusted by French subjects. Maria Theresa understood these contradictions perfectly, but she also recognized that this marriage represented Austria's best hope for preventing another devastating war with France. The 7 Years' War had ended just a few years earlier, leaving both empires exhausted and desperate for stable peace. A Habsburg princess on the French throne could guarantee that peace for generations, making the personal sacrifice of one daughter worthwhile for the security of millions of subjects. The preparation for Maria Antonia's transformation began in earnest when she turned 13. French tutors arrived in Vienna to reshape not just her language skills, but her entire worldview. She was taught to think like a French princess, to understand French history from a French perspective, and to embrace French customs as naturally as breathing. This cultural conversion was systematic and thorough, designed to eliminate any trace of Austrian influence that might later be used against her by French critics. Yet the very completeness of this transformation would eventually become one of Marie Antoinette's greatest vulnerabilities. By learning to be perfectly French, she would lose the Austrian identity that might have provided her with alternative sources of support during her later troubles. She was creating a self that existed only within the specific context of French royal approval, leaving her desperately dependent on maintaining the favor of people who were predisposed to distrust her foreign origins. The physical preparations for the marriage were equally elaborate and symbolically significant. Maria Antonia's trousseau required months to assemble, with seamstresses working around the clock to create wardrobes that would establish her status as the most magnificently dressed woman in Europe. Every gown, every piece of jewelry, every accessory was chosen to send specific messages about Austrian wealth, French taste, and imperial power. The wedding dress itself was a masterpiece of diplomatic messaging, incorporating Austrian symbols with French aesthetics in ways that honored both traditions, while clearly establishing the bride's new national loyalty. The silk came from French looms, the lace from French artisans, the pearls from French colonial territories. Even the threads used for embroidery were specifically chosen to demonstrate France's commercial and artistic superiority over its European rivals. But beneath these magnificent preparations lay a deeper transformation that would shape Marie Antoinette's entire approach to queenship. The Habsburg court that had raised her operated according to Spanish etiquette that emphasized dignity, formality, and careful distance between royalty and subjects. The French court she was entering celebrated a completely different style of royal behavior that prized charm, accessibility, and the ability to make courtiers feel personally connected to their sovereign. This difference in courtly expectations would create constant problems for Marie Antoinette throughout her reign. Behaviors that seemed natural and appropriate to someone raised in Austrian traditions would be interpreted by French observers as evidence of frivolity, manipulation, or dangerous foreign influence. Her attempts to adapt to French expectations would be seen as proof that she was abandoning the dignity appropriate to her royal position. The farewell ceremonies in Vienna were designed to emphasize the finality of Maria Antonia's transformation into Marie Antoinette. She was required to leave behind not just her family and homeland, but every personal possession that might remind her of her Austrian origins. The clothes she had worn, the books she had read, Even the jewelry she had received as gifts from Austrian relatives were all abandoned at the border between the two empires. This symbolic death and rebirth was intended to demonstrate Marie Antoinette's complete commitment to her new French identity, but it also eliminated the personal anchors that might have helped her maintain psychological stability during the difficult years ahead. She was entering France as a woman without a past, expected to create an entirely new self that would satisfy impossible expectations while navigating treacherous political currents that she barely understood. The journey from Vienna to Versailles took several weeks, with elaborate ceremonies at every major stop designed to introduce the future queen to her new subjects. These events revealed both the promise and the problems that would define Marie Antoinette's relationship with the French people. Crowds gathered enthusiastically to see their future queen, charmed by her youth, beauty, and apparent accessibility. Yet even these early encounters contained warning signs of future troubles. Some observers noted that the young Dauphine seemed more Austrian than French in her mannerisms, while others criticized her apparent enjoyment of luxury and ceremony as evidence of inappropriate priorities. The very qualities that made her appealing as a person, her natural warmth and obvious pleasure in beautiful things, were being interpreted as potential character flaws that might make her unsuitable as a queen. As her carriage approached the gates of Versailles for the first time, 14-year-old Marie Antoinette could not have imagined that she was entering not just a palace, but a trap that would ultimately destroy her. The magnificent building that rose before her represented the pinnacle of royal power and artistic achievement, but it also embodied political and social contradictions that would soon tear France apart. The Palace of Versailles was more than just a residence for the royal family. It was a complete world unto itself, housing thousands of courtiers, servants, and hangers on whose entire existence revolved around proximity to royal power. This artificial society operated according to rules that had evolved over generations, creating a complex ecosystem of rivalry, alliance, and intrigue that newcomers navigated at their peril. Marie Antoinette's first glimpse of her new home revealed both its splendor and its fundamental problems. The Hall of Mirrors stretched before her like a golden tunnel, its 17 arched windows reflecting endless images of courtiers who bowed and curtsied in perfect synchronization. Yet beneath this choreographed perfection lay financial realities that would soon become impossible to ignore. The very magnificence that was supposed to demonstrate French power was actually evidence of French weakness. Every chandelier, every piece of furniture, every decorative detail represented money that the royal treasury could not afford to spend. The palace that symbolized absolute monarchy was slowly bankrupting the kingdom it was meant to glorify, creating economic pressures that would eventually explode into revolutionary violence. Marie Antoinette's introduction to this glittering world began with ceremonies that would have exhausted someone twice her age. The formal presentation to the court required her to stand for hours while hundreds of nobles filed past, each one scrutinizing her appearance, her manner, her French pronunciation for any sign of foreign inadequacy. These early encounters established patterns that would define her entire relationship with French aristocracy. The courtiers who surrounded her were not simply decorative figures enjoying royal hospitality. They were political actors whose fortunes depended entirely on their ability to influence royal decisions and gain access to the patronage that flowed from the throne. Every conversation was a negotiation. Every gesture carried multiple meanings, and every friendship concealed potential betrayal. Marie Antoinette entered this world with the emotional honesty of a teenager, completely unprepared for the sophisticated deceptions that governed daily life at Versailles. Her marriage to the Dauphin Louis Auguste revealed immediately that her personal happiness would always be secondary to political necessity. The young man she wed was nothing like the romantic princes she had imagined during her sheltered childhood in Vienna. Louis Auguste was awkward, introverted, and far more interested in mechanical devices than in the social graces that made court life bearable. Their wedding night was a disaster that established patterns of mutual incomprehension that would plague their relationship for years. The failure of their marriage to produce immediate heirs created a political crisis that transformed Marie Antoinette from a promising young Dauphine into a figure of national speculation and criticism. French succession law required legitimate male heirs to ensure dynastic stability, making the royal couple's private difficulties a matter of urgent public concern. Courtiers who had initially welcomed the charming Austrian princess began to whisper that perhaps she was barren, or worse, that she was deliberately avoiding pregnancy to serve Austrian rather than French interests. These rumors revealed the impossible position that Marie Antoinette occupied within French political culture. As a foreign princess, she was automatically suspected of divided loyalties, but as a potential queen mother, she was expected to produce French heirs who would strengthen the dynasty. Her failure to immediately fulfill this biological imperative was interpreted not as a private misfortune, but as evidence of potential treason against the French crown. The young Dauphine's response to these pressures demonstrated both her resilience and her fundamental misunderstanding of her political situation. Rather than retreating into dignified silence, she threw herself into the social life of Versailles with an enthusiasm that delighted her friends and horrified her critics. She danced until dawn, gambled with reckless abandon, and surrounded herself with a circle of companions who shared her love of pleasure and her apparent indifference to political consequences. This behavior was natural for someone of her age and temperament, but it was catastrophic for her public image. French subjects who were struggling with economic hardships that made basic survival difficult could not understand why their future queen seemed to spend every waking moment in pursuit of entertainment. The contrast between royal luxury and popular suffering was becoming impossible to ignore, creating resentments that would eventually explode into revolutionary fury. The cultural differences that separated Austrian and French approaches to royal behavior became more pronounced as Marie Antoinette attempted to establish her own style of queenship. The Austrian court that had raised her emphasized personal virtue and religious devotion as the foundations of legitimate authority. Rulers were expected to demonstrate their worthiness through moral example and careful attention to their subjects' welfare. French royal tradition, by contrast, had evolved to celebrate the monarch as a semi-divine figure whose very existence transcended ordinary moral categories. The king and queen were supposed to embody perfection, so complete that normal human limitations simply did not apply to them. This theoretical elevation above humanity was supposed to justify their absolute power over their subjects' lives and property. Marie Antoinette's attempts to reconcile these conflicting expectations created confusion that her enemies would eventually exploit to destroy her. When she tried to demonstrate virtue through personal piety and charitable works, critics accused her of hypocrisy for maintaining religious practices while living in obvious luxury. When she embraced the divine pretensions of French royalty, opponents pointed to her foreign origins as evidence that she was unsuited for such elevated status. The birth of her first child in 1778 finally provided Marie Antoinette with the political security she had desperately needed. But it also exposed her to new forms of criticism that revealed the deep contradictions within French attitudes toward royal power. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the birth were designed to demonstrate that the Queen had fulfilled her most important duty by producing a potential heir to the throne. Yet the very public nature of these celebrations also highlighted the artificial character of a royal family life at Versailles. The Queen's pregnancy, labour and recovery were managed as public spectacles rather than private experiences, with courtiers monitoring every detail to ensure that proper protocols were followed. This transformation of intimate moments into political theatre reflected the broader ways that royal identity had become completely separated from normal human experience. The child, Princess Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, was welcomed with genuine relief by the royal family, but her gender created new anxieties about the succession that would continue to plague the monarchy. French law required male heirs to ensure legitimate succession. meaning that Marie Antoinette would need to produce sons to truly secure her political position. The pressure to bear male children would dominate her life for the next several years, creating stress that affected both her physical health and her emotional stability. Meanwhile, the economic problems that had been building throughout Louis XV's reign were becoming impossible to ignore. The 7 Years' War had left France with debts that consumed an enormous portion of royal revenues, leaving insufficient funds for basic governmental functions. The tax system that was supposed to support the monarchy had become so riddled with exemptions and inefficiencies that it actually increased economic inequality while failing to generate adequate income. Marie Antoinette's involvement in these financial discussions was limited by both her gender and her foreign origins, but she could not escape the political consequences of decisions made in her name. Every royal expenditure was scrutinized for evidence of wasteful spending, with particular attention paid to anything that could be attributed to the Queen's supposed extravagance. Her clothes, her jewellery, her entertainment expenses all became symbols of royal indifference to popular suffering. The Queen's patronage of arts and culture, which should have enhanced her reputation as a sophisticated ruler, instead became evidence of her inappropriate priorities. The magnificent performances she sponsored at the Royal Opera were criticised as wasteful diversions from urgent governmental business. The artists and writers she supported were dismissed as parasites whose creative work contributed nothing to France's economic recovery. These attacks on Marie Antoinette's cultural activities reflected broader changes in French intellectual life that were undermining traditional justifications for absolute monarchy. Enlightenment philosophers were developing new theories about political legitimacy that emphasized the consent of the governed rather than divine right as the foundation of governmental authority. These ideas were spreading through French society via books, pamphlets, and salon conversations that gradually convinced educated people that their rulers were not divinely appointed figures deserving automatic obedience. The Queen's Austrian origins made her particularly vulnerable to these new forms of political criticism because they provided her enemies with ready-made arguments about her illegitimacy as a French ruler. Enlightenment thinkers who opposed absolute monarchy could point to Marie Antoinette as evidence that the royal family served foreign rather than French interests, making revolution seem like patriotic duty rather than treasonous rebellion. The birth of the Dauphin. Louis Joseph in 1781 should have resolved the succession crisis that had plagued Marie Antoinette's early years as queen, but it actually intensified the political pressures she faced. The existence of a male heir meant that the monarchy's future was secure, but it also meant that the Queen's political value had been largely exhausted. She was no longer essential for dynastic continuity, making her expendable if political circumstances required a scapegoat for France's mounting problems. The elaborate celebrations surrounding the Dauphin's birth revealed how completely the royal family had become isolated from the economic realities facing their subjects. While ordinary French families struggled to afford basic necessities, Versailles was spending enormous sums on ceremonies designed to celebrate the arrival of another mouth that would need to be fed from public revenues. The contrast between royal celebration and popular suffering was becoming too obvious to ignore or excuse. Marie Antoinette's response to growing criticism demonstrated her fundamental inability to understand the political situation she faced. Rather than moderating her behavior to address popular concerns, she seemed to become more defiant in her pursuit of pleasure and more obvious in her display of wealth. This reaction was psychologically understandable for someone who had never experienced genuine adversity, but it was politically suicidal in a kingdom where revolutionary ideas were beginning to find receptive audiences. The Queen's friendship with Princess Lamballe, and later with Gabrielle de Polignac, created additional scandals that her enemies exploited to undermine her reputation. These relationships were probably innocent expressions of her need for genuine companionship. In a world where most interactions were calculated political maneuvers. But in the febrile atmosphere of pre-revolutionary France, any close friendship between women was subject to malicious interpretation designed to destroy reputations and discredit political figures. The whispered accusations about Marie Antoinette's friendships revealed the poisonous nature of court gossip that would eventually consume her entirely. Every glance, every private conversation, every moment of apparent intimacy was dissected by courtiers whose own positions depended on their ability to provide scandalous intelligence to rival factions. The Queen's natural warmth, which had once charmed observers, now became evidence of dangerous emotional instability that supposedly made her unfit for the dignity required of French royalty. These personal attacks were particularly devastating because they targeted the very qualities that made Marie Antoinette human, rather than simply a political symbol. Her capacity for genuine friendship, her spontaneous laughter, her obvious pleasure in beautiful things, all of these traits that should have made her more relatable to her subjects were twisted into proof of moral corruption that threatened the kingdom's spiritual foundations. The affair of the diamond necklace in 1785 would destroy whatever remained of Marie Antoinette's reputation among the French people, even though she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. This elaborate fraud, orchestrated by the Comtesse de la Motte, exploited the Queen's name to deceive Cardinal de Rohan into purchasing an extraordinarily expensive necklace under the false belief that Marie Antoinette had secretly commissioned it. The necklace itself was a monument to the excess that characterized pre-revolutionary France. Created by the royal jewelers Baumer and Bassange, it contained over 600 diamonds, arranged in elaborate festoons and tassels that would have weighed several pounds when worn. The price, over 1.5 million livres, represented more than the annual income of thousands of ordinary French families. Even the existence of such an object seemed to mock the poverty that was spreading throughout the kingdom. Cardinal de Rohan's willingness to believe that the Queen would secretly purchase such an extravagant piece revealed the extent to which Marie Antoinette's reputation for frivolous spending had become accepted even among sophisticated observers. The Cardinal, despite his high rank and considerable intelligence, found it entirely plausible that the Queen would commission jewelry worth a fortune, while France struggled with mounting debts and social unrest. The forged correspondence that convinced the Cardinal of the Queen's involvement demonstrated remarkable skill in mimicking both her writing style and her supposed personality. The letters portrayed Marie Antoinette as impulsive, secretive, and obsessed with luxury to the point of recklessness. These fictional characteristics aligned so perfectly with popular perceptions of the Queen that the forgeries seemed more authentic than her actual writings. When the fraud was discovered, the resulting scandal destroyed reputations throughout the French court, while providing revolutionary propagandists with perfect ammunition for their attacks on royal legitimacy. The fact that Marie Antoinette was innocent of any involvement in the scheme seemed irrelevant to public opinion, which had already decided that her guilt was consistent with everything they believed about her character and priorities. The trial of Cardinal de Rohan became a public spectacle that transformed a criminal proceeding into a referendum on royal authority itself. The Cardinal's defense strategy centered on portraying himself as the victim of a conspiracy that exploited his naive trust in royal goodness. This approach required his lawyers to suggest that the Queen's reputation was so thoroughly corrupted that reasonable people could believe she would engage in elaborate deceptions to acquire expensive jewelry. Marie Antoinette's response to these accusations revealed both her political naivety and her genuine bewilderment at the hostility she faced from subjects she had tried to serve according to her understanding of royal duty. She could not comprehend how her innocent desire for beautiful things had been transformed into evidence of moral depravity that supposedly threatened the kingdom's survival. Her confusion was genuine, but it was also politically fatal because it demonstrated her complete disconnection from the economic realities that shaped her subjects' daily lives. The Queen's attempts to rehabilitate her image through charitable works and public appearances only seemed to confirm popular suspicions about her motives and character. When she visited hospitals or distributed money to poor families, critics dismissed these activities as calculated attempts to manipulate public opinion, rather than genuine expressions of royal compassion. Her foreign origins made it impossible for her to receive credit for good intentions because any virtuous behavior could be attributed to Austrian manipulation rather than French patriotism. The birth of her second son, Louis Charles, in 1785, provided temporary respite from political pressures, but it also highlighted the growing isolation of the royal family from their subjects' affections. The celebrations surrounding the birth were more subdued than those that had welcomed previous royal children, reflecting popular awareness that France could no longer afford the magnificent ceremonies that had traditionally marked such occasions. The little prince's christening revealed the extent to which financial constraints were limiting even the most basic royal functions. The ceremony, while still elaborate by ordinary standards, was noticeably simpler than previous royal baptisms, with fewer guests, less expensive decorations, and reduced expenditures on food and entertainment. These economies were necessary to avoid further inflaming public opinion, but they also signaled the monarchy's weakening position within French society. Marie Antoinette's relationship with her children provided her with genuine happiness that contrasted sharply with the artificial pleasures that dominated court life. Her maternal instincts were strong and authentic, leading her to spend far more time with her offspring than was customary for royal mothers. This devotion to her children was admirable from a human perspective, but it created additional political problems because it seemed to confirm that her primary loyalties lay with her family rather than with France. The Queen's decision to have her children educated according to more natural principles, influenced by Enlightenment theories about childhood development, was misinterpreted as evidence of dangerous foreign influences corrupting the next generation of French rulers. Her attempts to give her children more normal childhoods, with less rigid protocol and more opportunities for spontaneous play, were criticized as inappropriate relaxation of standards that maintained royal dignity and authority. So, the construction of the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's private retreat within the grounds of Versailles, became the ultimate symbol of her supposed extravagance and indifference to popular suffering. This modest palace, which she had commissioned to provide herself with a space for more intimate gatherings and personal reflection, was portrayed by her enemies as evidence of unlimited royal greed that consumed resources desperately needed for national welfare. The reality of the Petit Trianon was far more modest than its reputation suggested. The building itself was elegant but relatively small, designed to accommodate private dinners and informal entertainments rather than the massive ceremonial functions that characterized main palace life. The gardens surrounding it were beautiful, but not extraordinarily expensive by the standards of aristocratic estates throughout Europe. Yet the symbolic importance of the Petit Trianon far exceeded its actual cost or significance. For Marie Antoinette's critics, it represented everything that was wrong with absolute monarchy: the ruler's ability to spend public money on personal whims, while subjects struggled with poverty and injustice. The fact that the Queen used this retreat to escape from the ceremonial obligations that defined royal existence was interpreted as evidence that she rejected the responsibilities that justified her elevated position. The famous hameau, or mock village, that Marie Antoinette created near the Petit Trianon would become the most notorious symbol of royal disconnection from reality. This collection of rustic cottages, where the Queen and her friends could play at being shepherdesses and dairymaids, seemed to epitomize the artificial nature of aristocratic existence that revolutionary theorists condemned as fundamentally corrupt and parasitic. The irony was that Marie Antoinette's pastoral fantasies reflected genuine longing for the simple natural life that Enlightenment philosophers celebrated as morally superior to artificial court existence. Her desire to milk cows and gather eggs represented sincere attraction to rural virtues that were becoming increasingly popular among educated Europeans, who felt alienated from urban sophistication and social pretension. But the Queen's ability to indulge these fantasies while real farmers struggled to feed their families made her pastoral games seem like cruel mockery of genuine rural poverty. The perfectly maintained cottages, the carefully bred livestock, the servants dressed as peasants who performed actual labour while she played at rustic simplicity. All of this created an image of royal frivolity that her enemies would exploit mercilessly in their propaganda campaigns. The financial crisis that had been building throughout Louis XVI's reign finally reached critical proportions by 1786, forcing the monarchy to confront economic realities that could no longer be ignored or postponed. The Assembly of Notables, convened to address the kingdom's fiscal emergency, revealed the extent to which France's financial problems had become insoluble within existing political structures. Marie Antoinette's role in these discussions was necessarily limited, but she could not escape responsibility for the crisis in public opinion. Every previous royal expenditure was scrutinized for evidence of wasteful spending that had contributed to national bankruptcy. Her clothes, her jewelry, her entertainments, her building projects all became symbols of the systematic mismanagement that had brought France to the brink of collapse. The Queen's attempts to economize and demonstrate fiscal responsibility came too late to affect public perceptions that had already crystallized around her image as the primary cause of France's financial difficulties. When she reduced her household expenses and cancelled expensive ceremonies, critics dismissed these efforts as calculated political theatre designed to deflect blame, rather than genuine recognition of past mistakes. The growing influence of Enlightenment ideas about political legitimacy made Marie Antoinette's position increasingly untenable, regardless of her personal behaviour or reform efforts. The fundamental premise of absolute monarchy, that royal authority derived from divine appointment rather than popular consent, was being challenged by intellectuals who argued that legitimate government required the approval of the governed. These new theories about political legitimacy made Marie Antoinette's foreign origins a permanent liability that could not be overcome through good behaviour or successful policy implementation. As long as she remained Austrian by birth, she could be portrayed as an alien presence whose interests were fundamentally incompatible with French welfare. The very qualities that had once made her an attractive diplomatic bride, her Habsburg connections and Austrian upbringing, now became evidence of her essential unsuitability for French queenship. The convening of the Estates General in 1789, the first such assembly in over 150 years, marked the beginning of the end for the old regime that had shaped Marie Antoinette's entire adult life. This unprecedented gathering of representatives from all three estates of French society created a forum for expressing grievances that had been accumulating for generations without adequate political outlets. The cahiers de doléances, or lists of grievances, submitted by constituencies throughout France, revealed the depth of popular resentment against royal policies and aristocratic privileges. Many of these documents specifically mention the Queen as a symbol of everything that needed to be reformed or eliminated in French government and society. Her name had become synonymous with the abuse of power that revolutionary theorists identified as the root cause of France's problems. Marie Antoinette's response to these attacks demonstrated her continued inability to understand the political transformation that was destroying the world she had known. She seemed genuinely bewildered by the hostility directed toward her personally, unable to comprehend how her innocent enjoyment of royal prerogatives had been transformed into evidence of criminal indifference to popular suffering. The early stages of the revolution created opportunities for the royal family to adapt to changing political circumstances and potentially preserve some form of constitutional monarchy. Marie Antoinette's influence during this crucial period would prove decisive in determining whether such compromises were possible, or whether the logic of revolutionary change would ultimately demand the complete destruction of royal authority. Her private correspondence during these months revealed the psychological pressure she faced as the familiar world of absolute monarchy crumbled around her. The ceremonies, protocols, and social relationships that had defined her existence for nearly 20 years were dissolving, leaving her without reliable guides for navigating the new political landscape that was emerging from revolutionary upheaval. The October days of 1789, when Parisian women marched to Versailles demanding bread and forcing the royal family to return to Paris, marked the end of Marie Antoinette's life as she had known it. The magnificent palace that had been her home became a museum of royal excess, while she found herself a virtual prisoner in the Tuileries Palace under the watchful eyes of revolutionary guards who viewed her as a potential enemy of the people. The transition from Versailles to the Tuileries Palace represented far more than a simple change of residence. For Marie Antoinette, it symbolized the complete collapse of everything she had understood about royal authority and her place in French society. The palace that had once showcased absolute monarchy's magnificent power now stood empty, its halls echoing with memories of ceremonies that would never again take place. In the Tuileries, surrounded by revolutionary guards who watched her every movement, the Queen found herself living under conditions that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The elaborate etiquette that had governed every moment at Versailles was replaced by the suspicious scrutiny of men who viewed royal protocol as evidence of aristocratic conspiracy against popular liberty. Every private conversation was potentially treasonous, every gesture subject to revolutionary interpretation. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Marie Antoinette had spent her entire adult life within systems designed to reinforce her elevated status and shield her from direct contact with subjects who might challenge royal authority. Now she faced daily reminders that this authority had evaporated, leaving her vulnerable to forces she barely comprehended and certainly could not control. Her correspondence during this period reveals a woman struggling to maintain dignity while confronting the reality that her previous understanding of queenship had become not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous. The very qualities that had once defined successful royal behavior, the display of magnificence and the maintenance of ceremonial distance from ordinary subjects, were now interpreted as proof of anti-revolutionary sentiment that threatened the new political order. The children's education became a particular source of anxiety, as Marie Antoinette recognized that her traditional approaches to royal upbringing were incompatible with revolutionary ideologies about equality and citizenship. The Dauphin, who should have been preparing for eventual succession to the throne, instead found himself learning lessons about popular sovereignty that contradicted everything his parents had taught him about divine right and hereditary authority. Marie Antoinette's attempts to shield her children from the harsh realities of their situation reflected both maternal instinct and political calculation. She understood that the survival of the monarchy might depend on the next generation's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. But she also recognized that too much adaptation might eliminate the very qualities that distinguished royal authority from ordinary political leadership. The Queen's relationship with her husband during this crucial period was complicated by their different approaches to revolutionary pressure. Louis XVI, temperamentally inclined toward compromise and negotiation, seemed willing to accept constitutional limitations on royal power if they allowed the monarchy to survive in some form. Marie Antoinette, by contrast, viewed such concessions as betrayals of fundamental principles that would ultimately destroy royal authority entirely. This disagreement between the king and queen about appropriate responses to revolutionary demands created additional stress within the royal family, while providing their enemies with evidence of internal discord that could be exploited for political advantage. Every private argument between the royal couple was potentially public knowledge, thanks to the network of spies and informers who monitored their daily activities. The flight to Varennes in June 1791 represented Marie Antoinette's most desperate attempt to escape the revolutionary trap that was closing around her family. This carefully planned journey toward the Austrian border was designed to place the royal family beyond the reach of revolutionary authorities, while enabling them to organize counter-revolutionary resistance with foreign support. The decision to attempt this escape reflected Marie Antoinette's growing conviction that compromise with revolutionary forces was impossible, and that survival required complete rejection of the new political order. Her Austrian origins, which had always been a political liability, now seemed like potential salvation if they could provide access to military assistance from her brother, Emperor Leopold II. The planning for the flight revealed both the Queen's determination and her continued disconnection from practical realities. The elaborate preparations, including specially constructed carriages and carefully coordinated timing, demonstrated sophisticated organizational capabilities. Yet the entire scheme was based on assumptions about popular loyalty and foreign intervention that proved catastrophically incorrect. The failure of the Varennes escape transformed Marie Antoinette from a political prisoner into an active enemy of the revolution in the eyes of French public opinion. The evidence of her attempted flight seemed to confirm every accusation that had been made about her foreign loyalties and anti-revolutionary conspiracies. Her innocence or guilt regarding specific charges became irrelevant compared to the symbolic meaning of her actions. The return journey to Paris provided Marie Antoinette with her first direct exposure to the depth of popular hatred that her name could inspire. The crowds that gathered along the route made no attempt to maintain the respectful silence that had once greeted royal processions. Instead, they shouted accusations and threats that left no doubt about their feelings toward the woman they blamed for France's problems. This confrontation with unfiltered popular opinion was psychologically devastating for someone who had spent her entire adult life insulated from direct criticism. The elaborate courtesy systems that had characterized court life at Versailles had protected Marie Antoinette from understanding how completely her public image had been destroyed by years of propaganda and scandal. The massacre of the Champ de Mars in July 1791, where National Guard troops fired on protesters demanding the king's abdication, demonstrated that revolutionary politics were becoming increasingly radical and violent. Marie Antoinette understood that these escalating tensions made her position more precarious, while also creating opportunities for counter-revolutionary forces that might restore royal authority through military intervention. Her secret correspondence with foreign courts during this period revealed the complexity of her situation as both a French queen and an Austrian archduchess. The letters she sent to her brother and other European rulers seeking military assistance were treasonous by revolutionary standards, but they represented logical attempts to preserve royal authority through legitimate diplomatic channels. The Declaration of Pillnitz, issued by Austria and Prussia in August 1791, seemed to offer hope for foreign intervention that might restore the French monarchy. This document declared that the restoration of royal authority in France was a matter of common interest to all European sovereigns, suggesting that military assistance might be forthcoming if other diplomatic efforts failed. Marie Antoinette's reaction to the Declaration of Pillnitz revealed both her political desperation and her continued misunderstanding of revolutionary dynamics. She interpreted this diplomatic statement as evidence of imminent military support that would soon liberate her family from revolutionary captivity. In reality, the declaration was primarily designed to satisfy aristocratic émigrés without committing the signatory powers to expensive military intervention. The war that began in April 1792 between France and Austria placed Marie Antoinette in an impossible position that made her destruction almost inevitable. As French queen, she was expected to support her adopted country's military efforts against foreign enemies. As Austrian Archduchess, she naturally hoped for Austrian victory that might restore her family's authority and security. Revolutionary propagandists exploited this conflict of loyalties to portray Marie Antoinette as an active collaborator with France's enemies, who was providing military intelligence and strategic guidance to foreign armies. These accusations were largely fabricated, but they were plausible enough to convince people who already suspected her of anti-French sympathies. The storming of the Tuileries Palace on August 10, 1792, marked the end of whatever remained of royal authority in revolutionary France. The brutal massacre of Swiss guards who defended the palace demonstrated that revolutionary violence had reached levels that made any restoration of monarchy extremely unlikely. Marie Antoinette's survival of this attack was almost miraculous, but it also ensured that she would face even more serious charges in whatever legal proceedings might follow. The imprisonment of the royal family in the Temple Tower created conditions that were deliberately designed to break their spirits and demonstrate the complete reversal of traditional power relationships. The medieval fortress that became their prison was chosen specifically for its associations with royal captivity during previous periods of political upheaval. Life in the Temple Tower stripped away the last vestiges of royal ceremony and protocol that had defined Marie Antoinette's existence for over 20 years. The simple rooms, plain furniture, and basic meals represented deliberate rejection of the luxury that revolutionaries associated with aristocratic oppression of the common people. The Queen's behavior during her imprisonment revealed remarkable resilience and dignity that contrasted sharply with the frivolous image that had dominated her public reputation. Faced with genuine adversity for the first time in her life, she discovered reserves of strength and courage that enabled her to maintain composure under conditions that would have broken many people. Her relationship with her children during this period provided the only source of genuine comfort available to her in captivity. The enforced intimacy of prison life allowed her to develop closer bonds with her offspring than had been possible during the ceremonial obligations that had structured family interactions at Versailles. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 eliminated whatever hope Marie Antoinette might have harbored for negotiated settlement that could preserve royal authority in some form. Her husband's death made her situation desperate in ways that went far beyond personal grief, because it demonstrated that revolutionary justice was prepared to eliminate royal authority completely rather than simply limiting its power. The widow Capet, as Marie Antoinette was now officially designated, faced charges of treason that carried automatic death sentences under revolutionary law. The legal proceedings against her were designed less to determine guilt or innocence than to provide public justification for eliminating the most prominent symbol of the old regime that the revolution had been created to destroy. The separation from her children, who were kept in different parts of the Temple Tower under separate guard, represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of her final imprisonment. Marie Antoinette's maternal instincts, which had provided her with purpose and identity during the darkest moments of revolutionary captivity, were deliberately frustrated by captors who understood that this psychological torture was more effective than physical abuse. Her transfer to the conciergerie in August 1793 placed her in conditions that were designed to demonstrate the complete degradation of royal dignity before execution. The former palace that had been converted into a revolutionary prison contained cells that had once housed common criminals, making the symbolic reversal of her circumstances unmistakably clear. The trial of Marie Antoinette before the Revolutionary Tribunal was a carefully orchestrated political spectacle rather than a genuine legal proceeding. The charges against her, ranging from correspondence with foreign enemies to corruption of her children with counter-revolutionary ideas, were designed to justify a predetermined verdict, rather than to establish facts through evidence and testimony. Her defense attorney, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, faced an impossible task in representing someone whose symbolic significance far exceeded any specific crimes she might have committed. The Queen's guilt or innocence regarding particular accusations was irrelevant to a tribunal that had been created to eliminate enemies of the revolution, rather than to administer impartial justice. Marie Antoinette's behavior during her trial revealed the personal transformation that had occurred during her years of revolutionary captivity. The frivolous young woman who had once been obsessed with fashion and entertainment had been replaced by someone who faced death with remarkable composure and dignity. Her final letter, written to Madame Elizabeth on the morning of her execution, demonstrated forgiveness toward her enemies that contrasted sharply with the vindictive hatred that had characterized revolutionary attitudes toward royal authority. This document revealed spiritual depths that had been invisible during her years of apparent superficiality at Versailles. The journey to the scaffold through the streets of Paris provided Marie Antoinette with her final confrontation with the popular hatred that had been building against her for over 2 decades. The crowds that gathered to witness her execution represented the triumph of revolutionary justice over aristocratic privilege, but they also demonstrated the violent extremism that would ultimately consume the revolution itself. Her execution on October 16, 1793, eliminated not just an individual woman, but a symbol of royal authority that had shaped European political culture for centuries. The death of Marie Antoinette represented the complete victory of revolutionary ideologies over traditional monarchical principles, establishing precedents that would influence political development throughout the modern world. The immediate aftermath of her execution revealed the complex legacy that Marie Antoinette would leave for future generations. Revolutionary propagandists celebrated her death as the elimination of France's greatest enemy, while counter-revolutionary forces transformed her into a martyr, whose suffering symbolized the injustices committed in the name of popular liberation. The historical reputation of Marie Antoinette has continued to evolve over the centuries since her death, with each generation discovering new aspects of her story that reflect their own concerns about power, gender, and political legitimacy. The teenage Austrian princess who became Queen of France continues to fascinate people who struggle to understand how individual choices and historical forces combine to create one of history's most dramatic tragedies. Her story remains relevant not simply because of its dramatic elements, but because it illuminates enduring questions about the relationship between personal character and political responsibility. The woman who was condemned for her supposed frivolity and extravagance was ultimately destroyed by forces far larger than any individual personality flaws or moral failings. The French Revolution that consumed Marie Antoinette also transformed European political culture in ways that continue to influence contemporary debates about democracy, equality, and legitimate authority. Her death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the conclusion of an entire historical epoch that had been based on fundamentally different assumptions about power and social organization. The Palace of Versailles, which had been the center of Marie Antoinette's world for nearly 2 decades, became a museum dedicated to preserving the memory of royal magnificence that revolutionary violence had swept away. The empty rooms and silent gardens serve as monuments to a way of life that was destroyed so completely that it can only be understood through historical imagination rather than lived experience. Yet the fascination with Marie Antoinette's story suggests that something essential about human nature transcends the particular political and social circumstances that shaped her tragic fate. Her journey from privileged youth to revolutionary victim continues to resonate with people who recognize universal themes of love, loss, and the struggle to maintain dignity under impossible circumstances. The legacy of Marie Antoinette extends far beyond the specific events of her life and death to encompass broader questions about how societies create scapegoats for systemic problems that cannot be solved through individual punishment. Her transformation from Austrian princess to French queen to revolutionary enemy illustrates how personal identity can be shaped and distorted by political forces that individuals cannot control or fully comprehend. The destruction of Marie Antoinette created ripples that extended far beyond the borders of revolutionary France, transforming her from a historical figure into a powerful symbol whose meaning would be contested and reinterpreted by successive generations. The woman who had once embodied the pinnacle of royal privilege became, in death, a complex icon representing everything from feminine vulnerability to aristocratic excess, from foreign interference to martyred innocence. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, the various factions that had emerged from revolutionary upheaval began constructing competing narratives about her life and significance. The Jacobins, who had orchestrated her destruction, portrayed her death as the necessary elimination of counter-revolutionary poison that had threatened to corrupt the pure ideals of republican government. Their propaganda emphasized her foreign origins and alleged treasonous correspondence as evidence that her execution had saved France from Austrian domination disguised as royal authority. The Girondins, who had been purged from revolutionary leadership before her trial, developed more nuanced interpretations that acknowledged her personal tragedy while maintaining that her death had been politically necessary. These moderate revolutionaries understood that Marie Antoinette's destruction reflected the dangerous extremism that was consuming the revolution itself, but they could not publicly defend someone who had become such a powerful symbol of everything the new republic opposed: counter-revolutionary forces, both within France and in the emigrant communities scattered across Europe, immediately began transforming Marie Antoinette into a martyr whose suffering symbolized the injustices committed in the name of popular liberation. These royalist interpretations emphasized her maternal virtues, her religious devotion, and her dignified acceptance of persecution as evidence that revolutionary violence had destroyed innocence rather than eliminating genuine threats to public welfare. The Catholic Church, which had been brutally suppressed during the radical phase of the revolution, found in Marie Antoinette's story powerful ammunition for its campaign against revolutionary atheism and materialism. Her final letter, with its expressions of forgiveness for her enemies and submission to divine will, became a sacred text that demonstrated the spiritual superiority of Christian resignation over revolutionary vengeance European monarchs, who had initially been cautious about intervening in French affairs, used Marie Antoinette's execution as justification for more aggressive military campaigns against revolutionary France. Her death provided them with a compelling moral argument that transcended the dynastic interests that had previously motivated their opposition to revolutionary government. The Austrian Empress, Marie Antoinette's niece, declared that her aunt's martyrdom had created sacred obligations that could only be fulfilled through the complete restoration of legitimate monarchy in France. The artistic and literary responses to Marie Antoinette's death revealed the profound cultural impact of her destruction on European consciousness. Painters created dramatic canvases depicting her final moments with religious imagery that emphasized her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual martyr. These works often portrayed her as a figure of almost supernatural serenity, surrounded by symbols of divine approval that contrasted sharply with the revolutionary chaos that had consumed her earthly existence. Writers throughout Europe composed poems, plays, and novels that explored the moral and political implications of her fate. These literary works often used her story as a vehicle for examining broader questions about justice, mercy, and the relationship between individual suffering and historical necessity. The most sophisticated of these artistic responses recognized that her tragedy reflected not just personal misfortune, but the collision between traditional social structures and revolutionary ideologies that neither side fully understood or controlled. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte and his eventual establishment of the French Empire created new opportunities for reassessing Marie Antoinette's legacy within the context of France's political evolution. Napoleon's restoration of many aristocratic forms and ceremonies seemed to vindicate those who had argued that revolutionary extremism had destroyed valuable traditions, along with harmful abuses. The emperor's own marriage to Marie Louise of Austria created symbolic parallels with Marie Antoinette's earlier union that suggested the possibility of reconciling revolutionary achievements with monarchical stability. The Bourbon Restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat provided official opportunities for rehabilitating Marie Antoinette's reputation and honoring her memory as a victim of revolutionary excess. The new government commissioned memorials and ceremonies designed to demonstrate that France had learned to distinguish between legitimate criticism of royal policies and the destructive extremism that had led to regicide and terror. These official commemorations were carefully crafted to promote national reconciliation rather than counter-revolutionary vengeance. However, the process of historical rehabilitation revealed deep divisions within French society about the meaning and legacy of the revolutionary period. Liberal intellectuals who supported constitutional monarchy and gradual reform argued that Marie Antoinette's personal tragedy should not obscure the genuine abuses that had made revolutionary change necessary. They maintained that her death, while regrettable, had been the inevitable consequence of a political system that had become incompatible with modern ideas about government and citizenship. Conservative thinkers, by contrast, used her story to demonstrate the inherent dangers of democratic politics and popular sovereignty. They argued that her destruction proved that revolutionary ideologies inevitably led to violence and injustice because they rejected the traditional restraints that had evolved over centuries to limit governmental power and protect individual rights. For these intellectuals, Marie Antoinette's fate served as a permanent warning about the consequences of abandoning established institutions in favor of abstract theories about political organization. The Romantic movement that dominated European culture during the early 19th century found in Marie Antoinette's story themes that perfectly embodied their aesthetic and philosophical concerns. Romantic artists and writers were fascinated by the contrast between her youthful beauty and her tragic fate, seeing in her destruction evidence of the sublime forces that shaped human destiny beyond individual control or comprehension. Her transformation from carefree princess to suffering queen to martyred victim provided romantic creators with a narrative arc that demonstrated their favorite themes about the relationship between innocence and experience, beauty and mortality, love and loss. The development of modern historical scholarship during the 19th century created new opportunities for examining Marie Antoinette's life and death through systematic analysis of documentary evidence rather than political propaganda or artistic imagination. Professional historians began investigating the actual circumstances of her reign, her personal relationships, and her political activities with methods designed to distinguish between verifiable facts and legendary accretions that had accumulated around her memory. These scholarly investigations revealed that much of the popular mythology surrounding Marie Antoinette had been based on deliberate fabrications created by her political enemies or romantic exaggerations developed by her defenders. The real woman, who emerged from careful historical research, was more complex and more human than either the demonic figure portrayed by revolutionary propaganda or the saintly martyr celebrated by counter-revolutionary hagiography. The famous phrase, "let them eat cake," which had been attributed to Marie Antoinette as evidence of her callous indifference to popular suffering, was demonstrated to be a complete fabrication that had been circulating in European literature long before she was born. Similar investigation revealed that many other accusations against her had been based on court gossip, political speculation, or deliberate misinformation, rather than documented evidence of actual misconduct. Yet these scholarly corrections had limited impact on popular understanding of Marie Antoinette's historical significance, because her symbolic meaning had become more important than factual accuracy about her personal behavior. The woman who had been destroyed by revolutionary justice continued to serve as a powerful representation of broader conflicts between tradition and innovation, privilege and equality, foreign influence and national sovereignty that transcended the specific circumstances of 18th century France. The emergence of feminist intellectual movements during the 19th and 20th centuries created new frameworks for interpreting Marie Antoinette's story that emphasized gender dynamics rather than purely political or religious themes. Feminist scholars argue that her destruction reflected not just revolutionary hostility toward royal authority, but deeper cultural anxieties about female power and sexuality that had made her particularly vulnerable to the kinds of personal attacks that had undermined her political position. These feminist interpretations highlighted the ways that criticism of Marie Antoinette had focused obsessively on her appearance, her friendships, her spending habits, and other aspects of her behavior that were typically used to police women's conduct rather than to evaluate political performance. The systematic destruction of her reputation through gendered insults and sexual innuendo revealed patterns of misogyny that had shaped not just her personal fate, but the broader development of European political culture. The 20th century's experience with totalitarian regimes and ideological violence created new contexts for understanding the revolutionary justice that had consumed Marie Antoinette, along with thousands of other victims during the Terror Scholars, who had witnessed the systematic persecution of entire social classes by Nazi and communist governments, recognized disturbing parallels between 18th century revolutionary extremism and modern totalitarian practices. These comparative analyses suggested that Marie Antoinette's destruction had been part of a broader pattern of ideological violence that targeted individuals not for specific crimes, but for their symbolic representation of social groups or cultural values. That revolutionary movements sought to eliminate her execution had established precedents for the kind of systematic persecution that would characterize the most destructive political movements of the modern era. The development of popular culture industries during the 20th century created new opportunities for reimagining Marie Antoinette's story through films, novels, and other media that reached mass audiences rather than educated elites. These popular representations often emphasized romantic and dramatic elements of her biography, while downplaying the complex political and social factors that had shaped her historical significance. Hollywood productions, in particular, tended to portray her as a tragic romantic heroine whose personal relationships and emotional experiences were more important than the broader historical forces that had determined her fate. These cinematic interpretations often reflected contemporary American values about individualism, consumer culture, and gender relations, rather than serious engagement with 18th century European political history. The late 20th century witnessed renewed scholarly interest in Marie Antoinette's story, as historians developed new methods for analyzing the cultural and social dimensions of political power. These approaches emphasized the importance of ritual, ceremony, and symbolic representation in maintaining governmental authority, suggesting that her destruction had reflected not just ideological conflicts, but fundamental changes in how European societies understood the relationship between rulers and subjects. Cultural historians argued that Marie Antoinette's fate had been sealed not just by her political mistakes or personal failings, but by her inability to adapt to changing expectations about royal behavior and public accountability. The ceremonial magnificence that had once demonstrated legitimate authority had become, by the late 18th century, evidence of illegitimate privilege that alienated rather than inspired popular loyalty. The bicentennial commemorations of the French Revolution in 1989 provided occasions for reassessing Marie Antoinette's historical significance within the context of France's ongoing struggles to balance democratic ideals with respect for individual rights and cultural traditions. These official celebrations revealed continuing divisions within French society about the legacy of revolutionary violence and the appropriate relationship between historical memory and contemporary political identity. Some commemorative events emphasized the progressive achievements of revolutionary democracy, while acknowledging that the terror had represented a tragic departure from the humanitarian ideals that had initially inspired political reform. These balanced approaches suggested that Marie Antoinette's destruction, while historically understandable, had violated principles of justice and human dignity that should guide modern democratic societies. Other celebrations maintained that revolutionary violence had been necessary to eliminate entrenched privileges and systematic oppression that could not have been reformed through peaceful means. These interpretations argued that Marie Antoinette's fate, however personally tragic, had been politically necessary to establish the democratic principles that continue to shape French political culture. The emergence of global feminist movements during the late 20th and early 21st centuries created international audiences for Marie Antoinette's story that emphasized her experience as a woman navigating patriarchal political systems that provided few opportunities for authentic female agency. These contemporary interpretations often portrayed her apparent frivolity and materialism as understandable responses to the limited roles available to women in aristocratic society. Feminist scholars argued that Marie Antoinette's destruction had reflected not just revolutionary hostility toward royal authority, but deeper cultural conflicts about appropriate feminine behavior that continue to shape women's experiences in modern democratic societies. Her fate served as a cautionary tale about the dangers facing women who challenged conventional expectations about female submission and domestic limitation. The development of consumer culture during the 20th century created new contexts for understanding Marie Antoinette's supposed obsession with luxury and fashion. Modern scholars suggested that her spending habits, while excessive by 18th century standards, had reflected emerging patterns of consumption and display that would become characteristic features of modern capitalist societies. These economic interpretations argued that Marie Antoinette had been ahead of her time in recognizing the political and cultural significance of consumer goods, fashion, and lifestyle choices. Her supposed frivolity had actually represented sophisticated understanding of how material culture could be used to communicate social status and political authority in increasingly complex commercial societies. The 21st century has witnessed continued fascination with Marie Antoinette's story, as contemporary audiences struggle to understand the relationship between celebrity culture, political power, and social media in democratic societies. Her experience of being simultaneously celebrated and vilified by public opinion seems remarkably relevant to modern debates about the role of personality and image in political leadership. Digital technologies have created new opportunities for re-examining historical evidence about Marie Antoinette's life, while also generating new forms of popular culture that reinterpret her story for contemporary audiences. Online communities dedicated to studying her biography have produced scholarship that challenges traditional academic boundaries while creating more democratic access to historical knowledge and interpretation. The enduring fascination with Marie Antoinette's story reflects not just interest in 18th century French history, but contemporary concerns about power, privilege, gender, and justice that transcend specific historical periods or cultural contexts. Her transformation from Austrian princess to French queen to revolutionary victim continues to provide insights into the complex relationships between individual agency and historical forces that shape human destiny. Modern biographers have emphasized the psychological dimensions of her story, exploring how someone raised in the artificial environment of absolute monarchy could develop the emotional resources necessary to face persecution and death with dignity. These psychological analyses suggest that her apparent superficiality during her early years as queen had concealed depths of character that only became visible under extreme pressure. The restoration and preservation of Versailles as a historical museum has created physical spaces where contemporary visitors can experience something of the world that shaped Marie Antoinette's understanding of royal authority and social hierarchy. Walking through the Hall of Mirrors or visiting the Petit Trianon allows modern people to glimpse the material culture that had defined her daily existence, while also recognizing how completely that world was destroyed by revolutionary change. These preserved spaces serve as monuments, not just to royal magnificence, but to the fragility of political and social systems that can appear permanent and inevitable to those who live within them. The empty rooms and silent gardens of Versailles remind contemporary visitors that even the most elaborate human institutions are subject to historical forces that can sweep away centuries of tradition in just a few years of revolutionary upheaval. The educational programs developed around Marie Antoinette's story in schools and museums throughout the world have created opportunities for young people to explore fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and historical change through engaging with her biography. Her life provides accessible entry points for discussing complex topics about political development, social inequality, and cultural conflict that continue to shape contemporary global society. Teachers have found that students respond powerfully to the human dimensions of her story, while also learning important lessons about the dangers of political extremism, the importance of understanding different historical perspectives, and the complex relationships between individual choices and social circumstances. Her transformation from privileged youth to tragic victim resonates with young people who are developing their own understanding of fairness, responsibility, and moral complexity. The ongoing scholarly debates about Marie Antoinette's historical significance reflect broader questions about how democratic societies should remember and interpret their past, particularly when that past involves violence and injustice committed in the name of political ideals that continue to shape contemporary governance. Her story forces modern people to confront uncomfortable truths about the costs of political change and the moral ambiguities that characterize most historical transformations. Contemporary historians continue to discover new documents and evidence that illuminate previously unknown aspects of her life and death, while also developing new interpretative frameworks that reflect changing understanding of gender, power, and political culture. These ongoing investigations ensure that Marie Antoinette remains not just a historical figure, but an active subject of scholarly inquiry that contributes to broader understanding of European political development. The international scope of interest in Marie Antoinette's story reflects the global impact of the French Revolution and the democratic ideologies that emerged from 18th century political upheaval. Her fate continues to resonate with people throughout the world who are struggling to understand the relationship between traditional authority and modern democracy, between individual rights and collective welfare, between peaceful reform and revolutionary change. Her legacy serves as a reminder that historical change always involves human costs that transcend the abstract benefits or drawbacks of different political systems. The teenage Austrian princess, who became Queen of France and was ultimately destroyed by forces she could not control or comprehend, continues to embody the complex relationships between personal tragedy and historical necessity that characterize the most significant moments in human political development. The story of Marie Antoinette remains unfinished because each generation discovers new meanings and relevance in her remarkable journey from privilege to persecution. Her life and death continue to illuminate enduring questions about power, justice, gender, and political change that will remain relevant as long as human societies struggle to balance competing claims about legitimate authority, individual rights, and collective welfare. Tonight, as we drift towards sleep in our own complex world of political uncertainty and social change, we can find both warning and inspiration in her story. The woman who faced her destruction with dignity and forgiveness demonstrated that human character can transcend the particular circumstances that shape individual fate, offering hope that courage and compassion remain possible even in the darkest moments of historical upheaval. The quiet halls of the Conciergerie still echo with the footsteps of history's most tragic queen, but her story extends far beyond those final months of imprisonment and trial. As we settle deeper into this gentle evening together, let us explore how Marie Antoinette's legacy shaped not just France, but the entire trajectory of European civilization in ways that continue to influence our world today. The immediate aftermath of her execution created ripples that spread across the continent like stones thrown into still water. In the salons of Vienna, her childhood home, courtiers who had once danced with the young Archduchess found themselves grappling with a new reality where royal blood offered no protection from popular fury. The Empress. Maria Theresa's carefully constructed diplomatic marriages, designed to create lasting peace between ancient enemies, had instead produced a martyrdom that would inspire counter-revolutionary movements for generations to come. The Austrian court's response to Marie Antoinette's death revealed the profound psychological impact her destruction had on traditional European monarchy. Emperor Francis II, her nephew, commissioned elaborate memorial services that transformed her from a political liability into a sacred symbol of royal suffering. These ceremonies were more than mere family grief. They represented a fundamental shift in how European rulers understood their relationship with their subjects and their vulnerability to popular uprising. The private letters exchanged between European courts during this period reveal a level of fear and uncertainty that had been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Kings and queens who had once viewed their authority as divinely ordained and permanently secure now found themselves questioning whether their own subjects harbored similar revolutionary sentiments. The comfortable assumptions that had governed aristocratic life for centuries were crumbling, leaving even the most powerful rulers feeling exposed and vulnerable. In Prussia, Frederick William II ordered his diplomats to study every detail of the French revolutionary process. seeking to understand how such apparently stable institutions could collapse so completely and so rapidly. These analyses focused particularly on Marie Antoinette's role in the monarchy's destruction, attempting to identify the specific mistakes that had made royal authority so vulnerable to popular attack. The Prussian court concluded that her foreign origins had been exploited by revolutionary propagandists, leading to new policies requiring future royal marriages to emphasize national rather than international political considerations. The British response to Marie Antoinette's execution demonstrated the complex relationship between democratic ideals and monarchical institutions that would characterize political development throughout the 19th century. Edmund Burke, the great conservative philosopher, used her fate as the centerpiece of his critique of revolutionary extremism, arguing that her destruction represented the triumph of abstract theory over human compassion and practical wisdom. His emotional description of seeing her at Versailles in her youth, before revolutionary hatred had transformed her into a symbol of everything the new order sought to destroy, became one of the most influential pieces of counter-revolutionary literature ever written. Yet even Burke's passionate defense of Marie Antoinette revealed the ways that her story had become more important as symbol than as historical reality. His famous description of her as a glittering vision of royal grace was based on a brief encounter that had occurred decades earlier, suggesting that his grief was for an idealized representation of monarchical legitimacy rather than for the complex human being who had actually faced revolutionary justice. This transformation of Marie Antoinette from person into symbol would characterize responses to her legacy for centuries to come. The impact of her death on European literature and arts created new genres of expression that explored themes of innocence destroyed by political fanaticism. The Romantic movement that emerged during the early 19th century found in her story perfect embodiment of their fascination with beauty, suffering, and the sublime forces that shaped human destiny. Poets throughout Europe composed elaborate verses that portrayed her as a figure of almost supernatural purity, whose destruction had revealed the essential barbarity underlying revolutionary claims about human progress and enlightenment. These artistic responses often emphasize the maternal dimensions of her tragedy, focusing on her separation from her children and her fears for their welfare as evidence of her fundamental humanity beneath the artificial conventions of royal protocol. The image of the grieving mother, torn from her offspring by political necessity, resonated powerfully with audiences who could identify with parental love, even if they could not understand the complexities of 18th century court politics. This emphasis on her maternal suffering helped transform public perception of Marie Antoinette from frivolous queen to tragic woman, making her story accessible to people who had little interest in aristocratic privilege or political theory. The religious dimensions of responses to her execution revealed the complex relationship between Christianity and revolutionary ideology that would influence European political culture throughout the modern period. Catholic theologians argued that her dignified acceptance of persecution demonstrated the spiritual superiority of Christian resignation over revolutionary vengeance, while Protestant thinkers emphasized her final letters' expressions of forgiveness as evidence that true faith could transcend political hatred and personal resentment. These religious interpretations of her death created new forms of popular devotion that treated her as an unofficial martyr whose intercession might provide protection for other victims of political persecution. Prayers composed in her memory circulated throughout Catholic Europe, while Protestant communities developed their own forms of commemoration that emphasized her moral example rather than her potential sainthood. The fact that these religious responses crossed denominational boundaries demonstrated the universal appeal of her story as an example of faith triumphant over worldly suffering. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte and his transformation of revolutionary France into an empire created new opportunities for reassessing Marie Antoinette's legacy within the context of French political evolution. Napoleon's restoration of court ceremony and aristocratic titles seemed to vindicate those who had argued that revolutionary extremism had destroyed valuable traditions along with harmful abuses. The emperor's marriage to Marie Louise of Austria created symbolic parallels with Marie Antoinette's earlier union that suggested the possibility of reconciling revolutionary achievements with monarchical stability. Yet Napoleon's own complex relationship with Marie Antoinette's memory revealed the continuing political sensitivity of her legacy even decades after her death. While he restored many aristocratic forms and ceremonies, he was careful to avoid direct rehabilitation of her reputation, understanding that any appearance of counter-revolutionary sympathy might undermine his authority with the former revolutionaries who formed crucial components of his political coalition. His silence about her fate spoke volumes about the continuing power of revolutionary mythology to shape French political discourse. The Bourbon Restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat provided the first official opportunities for publicly honoring Marie Antoinette's memory and acknowledging the injustices she had suffered at revolutionary hands. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed king, commissioned elaborate memorial ceremonies designed to demonstrate that France had learned to distinguish between legitimate criticism of royal policies and the destructive extremism that had led to regicide and terror. These commemorations were carefully crafted to promote national reconciliation rather than counter-revolutionary vengeance. The chapel built at the site of her grave became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout Europe who sought to pay respects to someone they viewed as a victim of political fanaticism. The simple monument erected in her honor deliberately contrasted with the elaborate tombs that characterized traditional royal burials, emphasizing her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual martyr. The flowers and prayers left by anonymous visitors demonstrated that her story continued to resonate with ordinary people who found in her fate reflection of their own struggles with forces beyond their control. The development of modern historical scholarship during the 19th century created new opportunities for examining Marie Antoinette's life and death through systematic analysis of documentary evidence rather than political propaganda or romantic imagination. Professional historians began investigating the actual circumstances of her reign, her personal relationships, and her political activities with methods designed to distinguish between verifiable facts and legendary accretions that had accumulated around her memory. These scholarly investigations revealed that much of the popular mythology surrounding Marie Antoinette had been based on deliberate fabrications created by her political enemies or romantic exaggerations developed by her defenders. The systematic examination of court records, diplomatic correspondence, and financial documents painted a picture of someone far more complex and human than either the demonic figure portrayed by revolutionary propaganda or the saintly martyr celebrated by counter-revolutionary literature. The famous phrase attributed to her about letting people eat cake was demonstrated to be a complete fabrication that had been circulating in European literature long before she was born. Similar investigations revealed that many other accusations against her had been based on court gossip, political speculation, or deliberate misinformation, rather than documented evidence of actual misconduct. Yet these scholarly corrections had limited impact on popular understanding of her historical significance, because her symbolic meaning had become more important than factual accuracy about her personal behavior. The emergence of feminist intellectual movements during the 19th and 20th centuries created new frameworks for interpreting Marie Antoinette's story that emphasized gender dynamics rather than purely political or religious themes. Feminist scholars argue that her destruction reflected not just revolutionary hostility toward royal authority, but deeper cultural anxieties about female power and sexuality that had made her particularly vulnerable to the kinds of personal attacks that had undermined her political position. These feminist interpretations highlighted the ways that criticism of Marie Antoinette had focused obsessively on her appearance, her friendships, her spending habits, and other aspects of her behavior that were typically used to police women's conduct, rather than to evaluate political performance. The systematic destruction of her reputation through gendered insults and sexual innuendo revealed patterns of misogyny that had shaped not just her personal fate, but the broader development of European political culture. The analysis of revolutionary pamphlets and propaganda revealed the extent to which attacks on Marie Antoinette had relied on specifically feminine stereotypes about vanity, frivolity, and sexual misconduct that would have been irrelevant if directed against male political figures. Her foreign origins were consistently sexualized in ways that portrayed her as a seductress who had corrupted French masculinity, while her interest in fashion and entertainment was interpreted as evidence of feminine weakness that made her unsuitable for political authority. These gender-based attacks reflected broader cultural anxieties about women's roles in political life that would continue to influence European society throughout the modern period. The revolutionary movement that had proclaimed equality and universal rights had simultaneously reinforced traditional gender hierarchies by eliminating the few spaces where aristocratic women had been able to exercise informal political influence. Marie Antoinette's destruction had established precedents for excluding women from political authority that would persist long after the specific revolutionary circumstances that had created them. The 20th century's experience with totalitarian regimes and ideological violence created new contexts for understanding the revolutionary justice that had consumed Marie Antoinette, along with thousands of other victims during the Terror Scholars who had witnessed the systematic persecution of entire social classes by Nazi and communist governments, recognized disturbing parallels between 18th century revolutionary extremism and modern totalitarian practices. These comparative analyses suggested that Marie Antoinette's destruction had been part of a broader pattern of ideological violence that targeted individuals not for specific crimes, but for their symbolic representation of social groups or cultural values that revolutionary movements sought to eliminate. Her execution had established precedents for the kind of systematic persecution that would characterize the most destructive political movements of the modern era. The development of mass media during the 20th century created new opportunities for reimagining Marie Antoinette's story through films, novels, and other forms of popular culture that reached audiences far beyond academic or political circles. These popular representations often emphasized romantic and dramatic elements of her biography, while downplaying the complex political and social factors that had shaped her historical significance. Hollywood productions, in particular, tended to portray her as a tragic romantic heroine whose personal relationships and emotional experiences were more important than the broader historical forces that had determined her fate. These cinematic interpretations often reflected contemporary American values about individualism, consumer culture, and gender relations, rather than serious engagement with 18th century European political history. The late 20th century witnessed renewed scholarly interest in Marie Antoinette's story, as historians developed new methods for analyzing the cultural and social dimensions of political power. These approaches emphasize the importance of ritual, ceremony, and symbolic representation in maintaining governmental authority, suggesting that her destruction had reflected not just ideological conflicts, but fundamental changes in how European societies understood the relationship between rulers and subjects. Cultural historians argued that Marie Antoinette's fate had been sealed not just by her political mistakes or personal failings, but by her inability to adapt to changing expectations about royal behavior and public accountability. The ceremonial magnificence that had once demonstrated legitimate authority had become, by the late 18th century, evidence of illegitimate privilege that alienated rather than inspired popular loyalty. The preservation of Versailles as a historical museum has created physical spaces where contemporary visitors can experience something of the world that shaped Marie Antoinette's understanding of royal authority and social hierarchy. Walking through the Hall of Mirrors or visiting the Petit Trianon allows modern people to glimpse the material culture that had defined her daily existence, while also recognizing how completely that world was destroyed by revolutionary change. These preserved spaces serve as monuments not just to royal magnificence, but to the fragility of political and social systems that can appear permanent and inevitable to those who live within them. The empty rooms and silent gardens of Versailles remind contemporary visitors that even the most elaborate human institutions are subject to historical forces that can sweep away centuries of tradition in just a few years of revolutionary upheaval. The educational programs developed around Marie Antoinette's story in schools and museums throughout the world have created opportunities for young people to explore fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and historical change through engaging with her biography. Her life provides accessible entry points for discussing complex topics about political development, social inequality, and cultural conflict that continue to shape contemporary global society. The digital age has brought new dimensions to Marie Antoinette's legacy, with online communities dedicated to studying her life and historical impact. Social media platforms have created spaces where people from around the world can share their fascination with her story, debate historical interpretations, and explore connections between her experiences and contemporary issues about celebrity, politics, and public scrutiny. These digital conversations often reveal how her story continues to resonate with modern audiences who struggle to understand the relationship between individual agency and social forces in their own lives. Her transformation from privileged youth to tragic victim provides a framework for exploring questions about responsibility, justice, and the limits of personal control that remain relevant across historical periods and cultural contexts. The ongoing scholarly debates about Marie Antoinette's historical significance reflect broader questions about how democratic societies should remember and interpret their past, particularly when that past involves violence and injustice committed in the name of political ideals that continue to shape contemporary governance. Her story forces modern people to confront uncomfortable truths about the costs of political change and the moral ambiguities that characterize most historical transformations. As we near the end of our gentle journey through her remarkable life and enduring legacy, we can see how Marie Antoinette's story transcends the specific circumstances of 18th century France to illuminate universal themes about power, privilege, gender, and justice. Her transformation from Austrian princess to French queen to revolutionary victim continues to provide insights into the complex relationships between individual choices and historical forces that shape human destiny. The teenage girl who left Vienna to become Queen of France could never have imagined that her name would continue to inspire fascination, debate, and reflection more than 2 centuries after her death. Her legacy reminds us that history is not just about grand political movements and abstract ideas, but about real people whose lives and deaths continue to shape our understanding of what it means to be human in the face of forces larger than ourselves. Tonight, as we prepare for peaceful rest, we can carry with us the image of Marie Antoinette facing her final dawn with dignity and forgiveness, demonstrating that the human spirit can transcend even the most tragic circumstances. Her story offers both warning and hope, reminding us that while we cannot always control the forces that shape our lives, we can choose how we respond to them with courage, compassion, and grace. In the quiet chambers of the conciergerie, where candlelight flickered against stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human suffering, Marie Antoinette spent her final weeks contemplating a world that had transformed beyond recognition. The woman who had once commanded the attention of Europe's most glittering courts now found herself reduced to a prisoner's simple existence. Yet in this reduction, she discovered depths of character that had remained hidden beneath years of ceremonial obligation. The revolutionary tribunal that would judge her fate represented more than a legal proceeding. It embodied the complete inversion of everything she had understood about justice, authority, and social order. The judges who would determine her guilt or innocence were men who viewed her very existence as evidence of crimes against humanity. They saw in her not an individual woman who had made specific choices under particular circumstances, but a symbol of systematic oppression that had to be eliminated for the revolution to achieve its purifying goals. Her defense attorney, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, faced an impossible task that revealed the fundamental nature of revolutionary justice. He was expected to provide legal representation for someone whose symbolic significance had already predetermined her fate. Every piece of evidence he presented, every argument he made on her behalf, was interpreted through the lens of revolutionary ideology that made genuine legal defense meaningless. The trial was theatre designed to provide moral justification for a political necessity that had been decided long before the proceedings began. The charges against Marie Antoinette read like a catalogue of everything the revolution opposed about the old regime. She was accused of corrupting her husband's political judgment, of maintaining treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies, of squandering national resources on personal luxuries, and of conspiring to restore absolute monarchy through military intervention. Each accusation contained enough partial truth to seem plausible, while being embedded in interpretative frameworks that made fair evaluation impossible. Her correspondence with her brother Leopold II, Emperor of Austria, became central evidence of her supposed treason against France. The letters she had written seeking assistance for her family were presented as proof of systematic collaboration with foreign enemies who sought to destroy French liberty and independence. The prosecutors made no distinction between a sister's desperate plea for help and a queen's calculated betrayal of her adopted country's interests. The financial records of her household expenses were scrutinized with microscopic attention to detail that transformed ordinary royal expenditures into evidence of criminal indifference to popular suffering. Every gown she had commissioned, every piece of jewelry she had purchased, every entertainment she had sponsored became proof of her callous disregard for the economic hardships that had driven ordinary French families to desperation. The prosecutors presented these expenses without context, ignoring the ceremonial obligations that had required such displays of magnificence and the economic benefits that royal patronage had provided to French artisans and craftsmen. Most damaging of all were the accusations regarding her influence over her children, particularly the Dauphin, who had been designated as the future Louis XVII revolutionary prosecutors, argued that she had systematically poisoned the young prince's mind with counter-revolutionary ideas that would have made him an enemy of the people when he reached maturity. They presented evidence of her teaching him about royal prerogatives and divine right as proof that she had been preparing him to restore absolute monarchy and revenge himself upon the French nation. Marie Antoinette's responses to these charges revealed the personal transformation that had occurred during her years of revolutionary captivity. The frivolous young woman, who had once been obsessed with fashion and entertainment, had been replaced by someone who faced accusations of capital crimes with remarkable composure and dignity. She answered questions directly and honestly, making no attempt to deny actions that could be proven while firmly rejecting interpretations that portrayed her maternal love and family loyalty as evidence of political treason. Her demeanor during the trial impressed even hostile observers who had expected to see either defiant arrogance or craven pleading for mercy. Instead, they witnessed someone who had found inner resources of strength that enabled her to maintain personal dignity while confronting the machinery of revolutionary justice that was designed to strip away every vestige of human worth from those it condemned. Her quiet responses to the most inflammatory accusations demonstrated a level of self-possession that contrasted sharply with the emotional extremism that characterized much revolutionary rhetoric. The testimony of witnesses called against her revealed the extent to which the revolutionary government had been collecting evidence about her activities for years before bringing formal charges. Servants who had worked in the royal household provided details about her daily routines, her private conversations, and her personal relationships that had been carefully documented and preserved for potential use in future legal proceedings. This systematic surveillance demonstrated that her destruction had been planned long before the specific circumstances that led to her trial. Many of these witnesses had been coerced or incentivized to provide testimony that supported the prosecution's case, making their statements unreliable as evidence but powerful as political theatre. Former courtiers who owed their survival to revolutionary tolerance found themselves forced to choose between loyalty to their former queen and their own safety. Most chose survival, providing testimony that confirmed popular suspicions about royal corruption and conspiracy, while protecting themselves from accusations of counter-revolutionary sympathy. The few witnesses who attempted to speak on Marie Antoinette's behalf faced immediate suspicion about their own political loyalties and revolutionary commitment. Their testimony was dismissed as evidence of continued aristocratic conspiracy, rather than honest evaluation of her character and conduct. The Revolutionary Tribunal had created a legal environment where defending the accused was itself considered evidence of political crime, making genuine justice impossible within the ideological framework that governed the proceedings. Marie Antoinette's final statement to the tribunal demonstrated the spiritual transformation that had occurred during her months of imprisonment and preparation for death. She acknowledged her mistakes and regrets, while maintaining her innocence of the specific crimes charged against her. Her words revealed someone who had come to understand her life and death within larger frameworks of divine providence and historical necessity that transcended the political calculations that had brought her to this moment. She expressed forgiveness for her enemies and acceptance of her fate in language that echoed Christian teachings about redemption through suffering. This religious dimension of her final testimony provided her with sources of meaning and comfort that were independent of the revolutionary ideologies that had condemned her. Her ability to find spiritual significance in personal tragedy demonstrated resilience that her captors had not been able to break despite months of psychological pressure and physical hardship. The verdict was announced with ceremonial gravity that emphasized the historical importance of the moment. Rather than the legal merits of the case, Marie Antoinette was found guilty of conspiracy against the liberty of the nation and sentenced to death by guillotine. The judges who pronounced this sentence understood that they were participating in a ritual that would transform French political culture by demonstrating that no individual, regardless of birth or status, was above the justice of the people. Her reaction to the death sentence revealed the complete acceptance of her fate that she had achieved during the preceding months of preparation. She received the verdict with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the trial, showing no signs of surprise or despair that might have provided her enemies with satisfaction. Her composure in the face of imminent execution demonstrated that she had found sources of strength that transcended the immediate circumstances of her political destruction. The brief period between her sentencing and execution provided opportunities for final letters and personal preparations that revealed the depth of character she had developed during her revolutionary ordeal. Her correspondence with family members and friends who remained alive demonstrated concern for their welfare rather than self-pity about her own situation. She used these final communications to express love, gratitude, and forgiveness rather than bitterness or resentment about the injustices she had suffered. Her letter to Madame Elizabeth, written on the morning of her execution, became one of the most remarkable documents in the history of political persecution. In it, she expressed complete forgiveness for those who had condemned her while acknowledging her own failings and mistakes. The letter revealed someone who had found peace with her fate and spiritual meaning in her suffering that enabled her to face death without hatred or despair. The preparations for her execution were designed to demonstrate the complete equality that revolutionary justice imposed on all citizens, regardless of their previous status or privileges. She was transported to the scaffold in the same kind of cart used for common criminals, wearing simple clothes that contrasted sharply with the magnificent costumes that had once defined her public image. This deliberate stripping away of royal ceremony was intended to show that the revolution had eliminated the artificial distinctions that had separated rulers from subjects. The crowds that gathered to witness her execution represented a cross-section of Parisian society that included many people who had never seen her during her years as queen. For most spectators, she was less a real person than a symbol of everything they had been taught to hate about the old regime. Their reaction to her final appearance would determine whether her death would be seen as justice triumphant or tragedy that revealed the cruel extremes of revolutionary fervor. Her behavior during the journey to the scaffold provided her final opportunity to influence how her death would be remembered by posterity. She maintained the same dignity and composure that had characterized her conduct throughout her imprisonment and trial, refusing to provide her enemies with the spectacle of royal weakness or desperation that might have justified their harsh treatment of her. Her calm acceptance of her fate impressed even hostile observers who had expected to see either defiant arrogance or abject terror. The execution itself was carried out with the mechanical efficiency that had become characteristic of revolutionary justice during the Terror. The guillotine that ended her life was the same instrument that had claimed thousands of other victims, demonstrating the equality of death that revolutionary ideology imposed on all enemies of the people. Her final moments were witnessed by hundreds of spectators who would carry their memories of this event throughout their lives, influencing how future generations would understand the meaning of her destruction. The immediate aftermath of her execution revealed the complex emotions that her death had generated, even among those who had supported revolutionary justice. Many spectators who had come expecting to celebrate the elimination of France's greatest enemy instead found themselves moved by the dignity with which she had faced her fate. Her transformation from symbol of royal oppression into suffering human being created moral complications that revolutionary ideology had not anticipated or prepared to address. The disposal of her body was deliberately designed to prevent the creation of martyrdom sites that might become focuses for counter-revolutionary devotion. She was buried in an unmarked grave along with other victims of the Terror, with no ceremony or memorial that might preserve her memory for future generations. This attempt to erase her from history reflected revolutionary understanding that her symbolic significance might persist beyond her physical destruction if appropriate precautions were not taken. Yet the very attempts to eliminate her memory from French consciousness revealed the continuing power of her story to influence political culture and historical understanding. The revolutionary government's sensitivity to her potential posthumous influence demonstrated that her death had not resolved the contradictions and conflicts that had led to her destruction. Instead, it had created new forms of political and moral tension that would continue to shape French society for generations to come. The news of Marie Antoinette's execution spread across Europe through diplomatic channels and newspaper reports that carried different interpretations of its significance to various national audiences. In Austria, her death was received as confirmation that revolutionary France had become completely dominated by extremist elements that posed existential threats to all European monarchies. The Habsburg court immediately began preparing for expanded military campaigns designed to restore legitimate government and prevent the spread of revolutionary contagion to other countries. British reactions revealed the complex relationship between democratic ideals and monarchical institutions that would characterize political development throughout the 19th century. Parliamentary debates about appropriate responses to her execution exposed deep divisions within British society about the proper balance between support for political reform and respect for traditional institutions. These discussions established precedents for how democratic societies would address questions about revolution, violence, and political change in their own territories and international relations. The impact on French émigré communities scattered across Europe was particularly profound, as Marie Antoinette's execution seemed to confirm their worst fears about the impossibility of negotiating with revolutionary authorities or finding compromise solutions that might preserve some elements of traditional government. Her death strengthened the resolve of counter-revolutionary movements, while also demonstrating the enormous risks involved in opposing the new regime that had consolidated its power through systematic elimination of all potential rivals. Religious leaders throughout Europe found in her execution powerful ammunition for their campaigns against revolutionary atheism and materialism. Her final letter, with its expressions of Christian forgiveness and submission to divine will, became a sacred text that demonstrated the spiritual superiority of traditional faith over revolutionary ideology. Churches across the continent held memorial services that transformed her from political victim into religious martyr whose suffering revealed the essentially anti-Christian nature of revolutionary extremism. The artistic and literary responses to her death created new forms of cultural expression that explored themes of innocence destroyed by political fanaticism. Romantic artists throughout Europe created paintings, sculptures, and literary works that portrayed her final moments with religious imagery, emphasizing her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual martyr. These cultural productions often depicted her as a figure of almost supernatural serenity, whose death revealed the fundamental barbarity underlying revolutionary claims about human progress and moral improvement. Writers across Europe composed elaborate works that used her story as a vehicle for examining broader questions about justice, mercy, and the relationship between individual suffering and historical necessity. The most sophisticated of these artistic responses recognized that her tragedy reflected not just personal misfortune, but the collision between traditional social structures and revolutionary ideologies that neither side fully understood or effectively controlled. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte and his gradual transformation of revolutionary France into an empire created new opportunities for reassessing Marie Antoinette's legacy within the context of French political evolution. Napoleon's restoration of court ceremony, aristocratic titles, and imperial magnificence seemed to vindicate those who had argued that revolutionary extremism had destroyed valuable traditions along with harmful abuses. His marriage to Marie Louise of Austria created symbolic parallels with Marie Antoinette's earlier union that suggested possibilities for reconciling revolutionary achievements with monarchical stability. Yet Napoleon's complex relationship with Marie Antoinette's memory revealed the continuing political sensitivity of her legacy even decades after her death. While he restored many aristocratic forms and ceremonies, he was careful to avoid direct rehabilitation of her reputation, understanding that any appearance of counter-revolutionary sympathy might undermine his authority with former revolutionaries who formed crucial components of his political coalition. His strategic silence about her fate spoke volumes about the continuing power of revolutionary mythology to shape French political discourse. The Bourbon Restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat provided the first official opportunities for publicly honoring Marie Antoinette's memory and acknowledging the injustices she had suffered at revolutionary hands. Louis XVIII commissioned elaborate memorial ceremonies designed to demonstrate that France had learned to distinguish between legitimate criticism of royal policies and the destructive extremism that had led to regicide and terror. These commemorations were carefully crafted to promote national reconciliation rather than counter-revolutionary vengeance. The chapel built at the site of her grave became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout Europe who sought to pay respects to someone they viewed as a victim of political fanaticism. The simple monument erected in her honor deliberately contrasted with the elaborate tombs that characterized traditional royal burials, emphasizing her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual martyr, whose significance transcended ordinary political categories. As our gentle evening draws toward its peaceful conclusion, we can see how Marie Antoinette's story continues to illuminate fundamental questions about power, justice, and human dignity that remain as relevant today as they were in 18th century France. Her journey from Austrian princess to French queen to revolutionary victim demonstrates both the fragility of human institutions and the resilience of human character when confronted with circumstances beyond personal control. The teenage girl who left Vienna with such hope and excitement could never have imagined that her name would continue to inspire reflection and debate more than 2 centuries after her death. Her legacy reminds us that history is shaped not just by abstract forces and political movements, but by individual human beings whose choices and sufferings continue to influence how we understand the relationship between personal destiny and historical change. Tonight, As we prepare for restful sleep, we can carry with us the image of Marie Antoinette, facing her final dawn with the dignity and forgiveness that revealed the depths of character she had discovered during her darkest hours. Her story offers both sobering warnings about the dangers of political extremism and inspiring examples of human grace under impossible circumstances, reminding us that even in history's most tragic moments, individuals can choose to respond with courage, compassion, and hope. The quiet halls of Versailles may stand empty now, their mirrors reflecting only shadows of the glittering world that once defined European civilization. But the woman who walked those halls continues to teach us about the enduring importance of maintaining our humanity regardless of the forces that seek to diminish or destroy it. Her remarkable journey from privilege to persecution to posthumous redemption demonstrates that true nobility lies not in the circumstances of our birth, but in how we choose to face the challenges that life presents to us all. The years following the Bourbon Restoration witnessed a remarkable transformation in how Marie Antoinette's memory was preserved and interpreted by successive generations, who struggled to understand her place. In the broader narrative of European political development, the simple chapel that marked her final resting place became far more than a memorial site. It evolved into a symbol of reconciliation between revolutionary ideals and monarchical traditions that had seemed irreconcilably opposed during the violent years of political upheaval. Visitors who made pilgrimages to this modest shrine came from every social class and political persuasion, united by fascination with a story that transcended the specific circumstances of 18th century court politics. Former revolutionaries who had supported the radical transformation of French society found themselves moved by evidence of her personal suffering, while conservative monarchists discovered in her fate confirmation of their deepest fears about the dangers of popular democracy unleashed from traditional restraints. The letters and memoirs left by these pilgrims reveal the complex emotions that her story continued to evoke long after the immediate passions of revolutionary conflict had subsided. Many visitors wrote about experiencing unexpected sympathy for someone they had been taught to view as an enemy of human progress, while others described feelings of shame about the excessive cruelties that had been committed in the name of political justice. These personal testimonies suggest that Marie Antoinette's death had created moral complications that French society was still struggling to resolve decades after the events themselves had concluded. The development of Romantic literature during the early 19th century found in her biography perfect material for exploring themes that defined the new cultural movement sweeping across Europe. Writers like Chateaubriand and Madame de Staël used her story to examine questions about the relationship between individual suffering and historical necessity, creating works that transformed her from a political figure into a literary symbol representing the collision between personal innocence and impersonal historical forces. These romantic interpretations often emphasize the contrast between her youthful beauty and her tragic fate, seeing in her destruction evidence of the sublime forces that shaped human destiny beyond individual control or comprehension. Her transformation from carefree princess to suffering queen to martyred victim provided romantic creators with a narrative arc that demonstrated their favorite themes about the relationship between beauty and mortality, love and loss, hope and despair. The emergence of professional historical scholarship during the mid-19th century created new opportunities for examining Marie Antoinette's life through systematic analysis of documentary evidence rather than political propaganda or romantic imagination. Historians like Jules Michelet began investigating the actual circumstances of her reign, her personal relationships, and her political activities with methods designed to distinguish between verifiable facts and legendary accretions that had accumulated around her memory through decades of partisan interpretation. These scholarly investigations revealed that much of the popular mythology surrounding Marie Antoinette had been based on deliberate fabrications created by her political enemies or romantic exaggerations developed by her defenders. The systematic examination of court records, diplomatic correspondence, and financial documents painted a picture of someone far more complex and human than either the demonic figure portrayed by revolutionary propaganda or the saintly martyr celebrated by counter-revolutionary literature. The famous accusation about her callous response to bread shortages, supposedly demonstrated by her suggestion that hungry peasants should eat cake, was proven to be a complete fabrication that had been circulating in European satirical literature for decades before she was even born. Similar investigations revealed that many other charges against her had been based on court gossip, political speculation, or deliberate misinformation rather than documented evidence of actual misconduct. Yet these scholarly corrections had limited impact on popular understanding of her historical significance because her symbolic meaning had become far more important than factual accuracy about her personal behavior. The woman who had been destroyed by revolutionary justice had been transformed into a powerful representation of broader conflicts between tradition and innovation, privilege and equality, foreign influence and national sovereignty that transcended the specific circumstances of 18th century France. The industrial transformation of European society during the 19th century created new contexts for understanding Marie Antoinette's supposed obsession with luxury and material display. As manufacturing processes made elaborate consumer goods available to broader segments of the population, her interest in fashion and decoration seemed less exceptional and more representative of emerging patterns of consumption that would characterize modern capitalist societies. Economic historians began arguing that her spending habits, while excessive by traditional aristocratic standards, had actually reflected sophisticated understanding of how material culture could be used to communicate social status and political authority in increasingly complex commercial environments. Her supposed frivolity had represented early recognition of the political and cultural significance of consumer goods that would become central features of modern democratic societies. These economic reinterpretations suggested that Marie Antoinette had been ahead of her time in understanding the relationship between personal style and public authority, making her destruction not just a personal tragedy, but a loss of innovative approaches to royal representation that might have helped traditional monarchies adapt more successfully to changing social conditions. Her experiments with informal court ceremonies and accessible royal behavior had anticipated developments in constitutional monarchy that would prove essential for institutional survival in democratic ages. The emergence of feminist intellectual movements during the late 19th and early 20th centuries created entirely new frameworks for interpreting Marie Antoinette's story that emphasized gender dynamics rather than purely political or religious themes. Feminist scholars argued that her destruction had reflected not just revolutionary hostility toward royal authority, but deeper cultural anxieties about female power and sexuality that had made her particularly vulnerable to the kinds of personal attacks that had systematically undermined her political position. These feminist interpretations highlighted the ways that criticism of Marie Antoinette had focused obsessively on her appearance, her friendships, her spending habits, and other aspects of her behavior that were typically used to police women's conduct, rather than to evaluate political performance. The systematic destruction of her reputation through gendered insults and sexual innuendo revealed patterns of misogyny that had shaped not just her personal fate, but the broader development of European political culture. The analysis of revolutionary pamphlets and propaganda materials revealed the extent to which attacks on Marie Antoinette had relied on specifically feminine stereotypes about vanity, frivolity, and sexual misconduct that would have been considered irrelevant if directed against male political figures. Her foreign origins had been consistently sexualized in ways that portrayed her as a seductress who had corrupted French masculinity, while her interest in fashion and entertainment was interpreted as evidence of feminine weakness that made her unsuitable for political authority. These gender-based attacks reflected broader cultural anxieties about women's roles in political life that would continue to influence European and American society throughout the modern period. The revolutionary movement that had proclaimed universal equality and individual rights had simultaneously reinforced traditional gender hierarchies by eliminating the few spaces where aristocratic women had been able to exercise informal political influence through court connections and personal relationships. Marie Antoinette's destruction had established precedents for excluding women from political authority that would persist long after the specific revolutionary circumstances that had created them. Her fate served as a warning to future generations of women about the dangers of challenging conventional expectations about feminine behavior and the risks involved in seeking to influence public affairs through personal relationships or cultural innovation. The development of mass media during the 20th century created unprecedented opportunities for reimagining Marie Antoinette's story through films, novels, radio programs, and other forms of popular culture that reached audiences far beyond academic or political circles. These popular representations often emphasized romantic and dramatic elements of her biography, while downplaying the complex political and social factors that had shaped her historical significance. Hollywood productions, in particular, tended to portray her as a tragic romantic heroine whose personal relationships and emotional experiences were more important than the broader historical forces that had determined her fate. These cinematic interpretations often reflected contemporary American values about individualism, consumer culture, and gender relations rather than serious engagement with 18th century European political history. The most successful of these popular adaptations understood that Marie Antoinette's story provided perfect material for exploring universal themes about youth, beauty, privilege, and mortality that resonated with modern audiences regardless of their knowledge about French history or revolutionary politics. Her transformation from sheltered princess to sophisticated queen to persecuted victim offered dramatic possibilities that transcended the specific historical circumstances that had shaped her actual experience. Yet these popular interpretations also contributed to the continuing mythologization of her story, often perpetuating romantic stereotypes that obscured the more complex realities that scholarly research had revealed about her character and historical significance. The tension between popular fascination and academic accuracy would continue to characterize responses to her legacy throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The digital revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has created entirely new possibilities for exploring and sharing Marie Antoinette's story through online communities, digital archives, and interactive media that allow unprecedented access to historical documents and scholarly interpretations. These technological developments have democratized historical research, while also creating new forms of popular engagement with her biography that transcend traditional boundaries between academic scholarship and public interest. Online forums dedicated to studying her life have produced collaborative research projects that combine professional historical methods with enthusiastic amateur investigation, creating new forms of knowledge production that challenge traditional academic hierarchies while maintaining rigorous standards for evidence and interpretation. These digital communities often focus on specific aspects of her story that have been neglected by conventional scholarship, such as her relationships with servants, her daily routines, or her responses to contemporary cultural developments. The preservation of Versailles as a UNESCO World Heritage Site has created physical spaces where contemporary visitors from around the world can experience something of the environment that shaped Marie Antoinette's understanding of royal authority and social hierarchy. The restoration of her private apartments, including the famous Petit Trianon and its surrounding gardens, allows modern people to glimpse the material culture that had defined her daily existence, while also recognizing how completely that world was destroyed by revolutionary change. These preserved spaces serve as powerful reminders of both the magnificence and the fragility of human institutions that can appear permanent and inevitable to those who live within them. The empty rooms and carefully maintained gardens of Versailles demonstrate how quickly even the most elaborate social systems can be swept away by historical forces that their creators never anticipated or understood. Educational programs developed around Marie Antoinette's story in schools and museums throughout the world have created opportunities for young people to explore fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and historical change through engaging with her biography. Her life provides accessible entry points for discussing complex topics about political development, social inequality, and cultural conflict that continue to shape contemporary global society. Teachers have discovered that students respond powerfully to the human dimensions of her story, while also learning important lessons about the dangers of political extremism, the importance of understanding different historical perspectives, and the complex relationships between individual choices and social circumstances. Her transformation from privileged youth to tragic victim resonates with young people who are developing their own understanding of fairness, responsibility, and moral complexity. The ongoing scholarly debates about Marie Antoinette's historical significance reflect broader questions about how democratic societies should remember and interpret their past, particularly when that past involves violence and injustice committed in the name of political ideals that continue to shape contemporary governance. Her story forces modern people to confront uncomfortable truths about the costs of political change and the moral ambiguities that characterize most significant historical transformations. Contemporary historians continue to discover new documents and evidence that illuminate previously unknown aspects of her life and death, while also developing new interpretive frameworks that reflect changing understanding of gender, power, and political culture. These ongoing investigations ensure that Marie Antoinette remains not just a historical figure, but an active subject of scholarly inquiry that contributes to broader understanding of European political development and its global implications. The international scope of interest in Marie Antoinette's story reflects the worldwide impact of the French Revolution and the democratic ideologies that emerged from 18th century political upheaval. Her fate continues to resonate with people throughout the world who are struggling to understand the relationship between traditional authority and modern democracy, between individual rights and collective welfare, between peaceful reform and revolutionary change. As we drift deeper into this peaceful evening, we can see how Marie Antoinette's legacy extends far beyond the specific events of her life and death to encompass enduring questions about human nature, political justice, and the relationship between personal character and historical circumstances. Her story continues to provide insights into the complex dynamics that shape political change and the moral challenges that confront individuals who find themselves caught between competing visions of social organization and legitimate authority. The woman who began her adult life as the most privileged person in one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms ended it as a symbol of the vulnerability that all human beings share when confronted by forces larger than themselves. Her remarkable journey from Austrian princess to French queen to revolutionary victim demonstrates both the contingency of human institutions and the resilience of human dignity when tested by extreme circumstances. Tonight, as we prepare for restful sleep, we can find in Marie Antoinette's story both sobering reminders about the fragility of the world we take for granted and inspiring examples of how individuals can maintain their essential humanity even when everything familiar has been stripped away. Her legacy continues to teach us that true nobility lies not in the accidents of birth or the privileges of position, but in how we choose to face the challenges that history presents to us all. The candlelight that once illuminated the magnificent halls of Versailles has long since been extinguished, but the memory of the young woman who walked those halls continues to cast its own gentle glow across the centuries, reminding us that every human story, no matter how grand or tragic, ultimately speaks to universal truths about love, loss, courage, and the enduring hope that sustains us through our darkest hours. The quiet echoes of her footsteps in those final prison corridors seem to whisper still through the passages of history, carrying with them lessons that extend far beyond the gilded cage of Versailles into our own complex modern world. As we settle deeper into this gentle night together, let us explore how Marie Antoinette's extraordinary story continues to illuminate the intricate relationships between power and vulnerability, between public perception and private truth, that shape human experience across all ages and cultures. In the decades following her death, something remarkable began to emerge from the ashes of revolutionary fury. The woman who had been systematically demonized as the embodiment of everything wrong with aristocratic privilege slowly began to be understood as something far more complex and tragically human. This transformation of her historical reputation reveals profound truths about how societies process trauma, assign blame, and ultimately seek reconciliation with their own capacity for both justice and cruelty. The children who grew up hearing stories about the wicked foreign queen gradually became adults who began to question the simplistic narratives they had inherited. As France struggled to rebuild itself from the devastation of revolutionary violence, many citizens found themselves wondering whether the systematic destruction of individuals like Marie Antoinette had truly been necessary for achieving the political changes they had sought. This growing ambivalence about revolutionary justice reflected broader questions about the relationship between means and ends that would continue to trouble democratic societies throughout the modern era. The letters and diaries kept by ordinary French citizens during the early 19th century reveal fascinating insights into how popular memory of Marie Antoinette evolved, as the immediate passions of political conflict gave way to more reflective consideration of what had actually been accomplished through her destruction. Many writers expressed surprise at discovering feelings of sympathy for someone they had been taught to hate, while others described experiencing unexpected guilt about their previous enthusiasm for revolutionary violence. These personal testimonies suggest that Marie Antoinette's death had created moral complications that extended far beyond the immediate political objectives it was supposed to serve. Her transformation from living symbol of oppression into martyred victim forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about their own capacity for hatred and the dangerous ease with which complex human beings could be reduced to simple political symbols that justified extreme measures. The emergence of photography during the mid-19th century created new possibilities for preserving and sharing images of the physical spaces that had shaped Marie Antoinette's life and death. The first photographs of Versailles, taken when the palace was still scarred by revolutionary damage, captured something of the melancholy that surrounded her memory during this period. These images revealed rooms where magnificent ceremonies had once taken place, now standing empty and partially ruined, their silence speaking volumes about the fragility of human grandeur. Similarly, early photographs of the conciergerie showed the stark prison cells where she had spent her final weeks, creating powerful visual contrast between the luxury she had known as queen and the harsh conditions she had endured as a condemned prisoner. These documentary images helped transform abstract historical knowledge into emotional understanding that touched viewers in ways that written descriptions could never achieve. The development of tourism during this same period brought increasing numbers of visitors to the sites associated with Marie Antoinette's story, creating new forms of popular engagement with her memory that transcended the political and religious frameworks that had previously dominated interpretations of her significance. These tourists came not as pilgrims seeking spiritual inspiration or political confirmation, but as curious individuals drawn by fascination with a story that seemed to embody universal themes about fate, suffering, and human resilience. Travel guides from this era reveal how Marie Antoinette's biography was being packaged for popular consumption in ways that emphasized dramatic and emotional elements rather than complex political analysis. Visitors were encouraged to imagine her daily routines, her personal relationships, and her emotional responses to the extraordinary circumstances that had shaped her life. This democratization of historical interest created new audiences for her story that would influence how it was told and retold for future generations. The construction of railways across Europe during the 19th century made these historical sites accessible to much larger numbers of people, transforming Marie Antoinette's memory from an elite preoccupation into a subject of broad popular interest that crossed national boundaries and social classes. Visitors from across the continent came to see the places where she had lived and died, creating international communities of interest that transcended the political divisions that had originally given her story its significance. And so, dear friend, as the final shadows of our evening settle around us, we come to the end of this remarkable journey through one of history's most extraordinary and heartbreaking lives. Marie Antoinette's story reminds us that beneath the grandest titles and most glittering circumstances lie universal truths about human courage, dignity, and the enduring power of forgiveness that transcends even the darkest chapters of our shared past. May her memory bring you peace as you drift into gentle dreams, knowing that tomorrow holds new stories waiting to unfold in these quiet hours we share together.